So tonight, as a sign of respect, we wish to begin this event by acknowledging the original inhabitants of the land in the 7 counties served by Genesee Valley Region PTA, the Onondaga, people of the mountain, Seneca, and Gayacono, people of the Great Swamp, Cayuga. Our very name, Genesee, is derived from the Onondagan word for pleasant bank. We sincerely thank and honor the tribal members of these 2 nations, original members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, also known as the Iroquois Confederacy. We recognize the unique relationship these Indigenous stewards have always had with the land as partners with, not masters of. We recognize their meaningful and rich traditions, and we also recognize and acknowledge the long history of genocide, colonization, broken treaties, and forced assimilation of Indigenous people that still takes place on this land. The Onondaga and Gayacono live here, raise their families here, and bury their dead here. Mindful of these histories, we work towards learning and voicing the truth of the past and the impact on the present day. As parent leaders, we understand a complete, unwhitewashed telling of history aids us in being more effective advocates for all children, irrespective of ethnicity, culture, religion, color, and socioeconomic background. This knowledge sows the ground for becoming a more welcoming, inclusive, and diverse organization. Finally, we encourage you to learn more about these Indigenous tribes, their history, and current standing in society. As the Genesee Valley Region Director and on behalf of the full Region Board, I want to welcome everyone to this evening's workshop on I'm from New York, I love New York City, implicit bias and how it shows up. Our region previously held 2 virtual workshops during the 2021 year. The first workshop was a presentation on racism and redlining in the Rochester area, presented by Rush Henrietta teacher Shane Weigard, who is a co-lead of the Anti-Racist Curriculum Project at the Pathstone Foundation. Our second event last spring was a discussion on the New York Times podcast, Nice White Parents, which examined how a parent group in the New York City School District had an influence on neighborhood schools during the past 50 years. This 2022 JEDI workshop series is designed to be a continuation of those conversations. As you know, PTA values collaboration, commitment, accountability, respect, inclusivity, and integrity as we work to advocate for every child with one voice. This workshop series, we hope, will provide not only a safe space for us to engage in thoughtful conversation and understanding of everyone's personal story and how it can affect how we see the world, but that it can also provide a guide for how we can bring this conversation to our own communities of influence so that our PTAs can be a true advocate for all children. Our facilitator, Jim Puglisi, has been a friend of mine since the early 1990s, which is a long time. We initially met on the campus of Grove City College in Pennsylvania. Jim has 30+ years experience in higher education administration, committed to building inclusive and transformative communities that support institutional values and mission with a particular focus upon the integration of equity and inclusion throughout organizational structures. He recently launched Puglisi Consulting, which is focused on bridging divides and building futures. He currently lives in Austin, Texas, but is joining us tonight from Portland, Maine. Jim, welcome to Genesee Valley.
Thank you. Had to find the unmute button. You think after 2 years it wouldn't be such a slow process, but still. So I'm very glad to be here with you tonight and just to join you. Just glad that Sonia felt she could invite me to this process, and so hopefully we'll have a beneficial experience tonight. She told you a little bit about me, pulling on my LinkedIn file, but yeah, I originally am from Pittsburgh, even though I live in Texas. I will never be from Texas. I am from Pittsburgh. That is my home. That's where my family is. That's where my grandparents came over from Sicily and settled. So I grew up in the same hometown as my grandparents came to, and that my dad grew up in. I'm a first generation college student, Sicilian American. And sometime around when I became 35, I also came to the understanding that I was white. And I can maybe explain a little bit more about that as we talk about implicit bias tonight. So I'm gonna share my screen and kind of get us going here. Can you all see that? Okay. That's probably one of the wordiest opening screens I've seen in a while, but it is what it is. So I always was, yeah, where I went to college in Meadville, I went to school with a lot of people from New York. And prior to that experience, if you told me you were from New York, I would just assume you're from New York City. And I got an education about that real quickly. And that was a bias that I had been acculturated to, and came to understand. So when I was trying to think of a title for that, that kind of came into mind for people in the Rochester area. So we're going to be talking about implicit bias, this kind of unconscious reality that we have. And in a lot of ways, implicit bias is an unconscious thing. It's not usually an intentional, conscious type of process. It goes underneath the radar, which kind of makes it a little bit more difficult to identify. And it takes an intentionality for people to be able to recognize where it exists and where it pops up. For us to do this tonight, I'm going to ask if we could honor some agreements about how we operate together in this space, because we're going to have a little bit of opportunity for people to participate and use your words. So for us to do that, we want to try to create not a safe space. In this work, there's really not a safe space, but hopefully we can create a brave space, a place where we can be honest and speak our words and kind of try to seek out where truth is and do it with love and grace and with commitment to stay engaged to this process. We won't have a perfect conversation, and the space will not be perfect. And that's just something that, I ask that we kind of wrestle with and be willing to engage in. So when we talk about these agreements, I'm going to ask that you stay engaged, that you listen, deeply listen, but also that you speak up when you need to speak up. Going to ask that you speak from your experience, so from I statements, not speaking about you heard somebody on the other side of the country had this experience, but really ask you to look into your own experiences and come from your own story, and stay with that. Experience discomfort. We may talk about some things that may be uncomfortable for some of us, and every time I have this conversation, I still recognize things in my own experience, and ask you just to sit with that, and be all right with that, and move forward. To expect and accept non-closure. This is not a thing where we'll have a 3-point plan and you'll walk out and know exactly what you need to do. This is kind of ongoing work, and it's a process of discovery in a lot of ways. Discovery about ourselves more than anything else. Could I ask you that you have curiosity to understand rather than to persuade. Again, this being willingness to inquire and look and seek. To racialize your voice. This next one's kind of my favorite, is brevity. Go for honesty, but don't go on and on. Try to respect the space so that all voices will have space to be heard and have an opportunity to respond. And then, we'll honor confidentiality, and Sonia's already spoken to that as far as recording some of this and what parts that we will let go forward and other ones don't, because we want people to feel like they can say what they need to say without it coming back on them later on. And that's just part of this work. So I'm going to ask us to try something. And some of the Sonia had put out, what were people hoping to gain from this time, and some of it was, how do you enter into this work? What are some tools and stuff? And I used the protocol from Courageous Conversations About Race from Glenn Singleton, and one of the things that he talks about is this compass that we all live in, and it has four sides to the compass. This believing side, this kind of, we're in a moral space of how we're thinking or entering into something. Some of us are like, give me the information, give me the facts, give me the data. I'm a thinker, I want to enter into there. Some of us are ready to act, like I want to get going, I want to do something. And some of us are just feeling, lots of feelings about things when we enter into space. And the reality is we are all moving in and out of these four areas. And some days we may be in our feeling space. Some days we may be in our thinking space. Some days we may be in our believing space, And part of how do we engage in this process is, how do you enter into a space? And how do you enter into conversation with other people? And are you aware of where you're at and how you walk? Because you may walk into the same space 2 days in a row in a different place, engaging in the same conversation, but you come into it from a different place of where you're at. Something may have happened that day that impacted you, something at home or whatever, or and are you mindful of that? And the reality is if you think of this compass, you're trying to kind of keep it flat. You don't want it tipping too far one way or the other. You're trying to kind of keep it at level as much as you can. So I'm going to ask you, you don't have to say your name, but if you can, if you would like to, but I'm going to ask each of you just to think which one you're in. And I'm going to ask you just to pick one, okay? Because we all want to say we're in all of them and all that. And I'm asking about where you think you're at in this very moment, okay? And to give one, very short sentence about why you think you're there, just to, give some explanation to it. And when I say a sentence, that implies that there's a period involved somewhere. It's punctuation involved. So again, kind of getting back to that brevity. So, and I know you haven't wrestled with these concepts and stuff, but give it a go. I'm in my thinking space because I'm presenting right now. And so I'm thinking about, what am I doing and how am I going about it? And so that's kind of, I'm wrestling with that, and also tipping a little bit into my feeling and making sure I'm getting over my insecurities of doing that. So that's where I'm at right now. And I'm just going to open it up and encourage each of you just to share. I appreciate people weighing in and sharing where they're at. Again, when you walk into these spaces, it's good to know where you are at, and it's also good to know where everybody else is at, so that you know how to engage them, and that you're not talking past each other, and you can have empathy about where a person is at, and and what's driving how they might respond in a discussion that day. And it helps to not make assumptions about the person, that might be misguided because you're not sure what's going on in their lives in that moment. So it's just something that, that's one little thing to be thinking about in this discussion. And, there was a lot of thinking tonight. You're going to be in other spaces where there's going to be a lot of feeling. And how do you respond to that if you're in a thinking mode and somebody else is in a feeling mode? So how do you engage that conversation in a way that you both can hear each other, and be mindful of that? So thank you for doing that. Let's see if I can figure out how to move this. Oh, there we go. So we're going to show you a video right now. It's about a 10-minute video. And I'm going to ask you to really be observant of what's going on in the video. What are things that are being shown? It's a story set in I'm assuming it's a New York train station. So just be observant of what are the interactions that are going on? What's the exchange that's going on? What are some assumptions that come to mind as you're watching? To be, thoughtful about, what are things that are evoked as you're watching? Because we're going to come back and kind of share about that and see what we come up with.
No, don't. Please don't touch it. I'll take care of those. No.
All right, let me give you a hand.
No, don't. No. You're making me miss my train.
How you doing? You know who it is, one and only. I know who you are, hot dog. You know I know who you is. How you doing? Happy New Year. May God bless you.
How much is this salad?
$2.
Well, I'm not sure that I have that much. $1. Hey, some more. Here's some more.
All right, $1.52. There you go, lady.
Thank you. Napkin?
Surely.
That's my salad. That's my salad. No, thank you. Thank you. Oh my God. Oh my Lord.
Everybody got any change? Any change? Can you spend some change? E, please, 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 man. Stop.
So, what were some of the things that you maybe saw, or what did you observe? What are some of assumptions you may have made mentally in your head about the various people in the film? Any stereotypes you may have jumped to, or you know, kind of like to hear how you reacted to this. Was there any examples of behavior that may have been, prejudicial without, even thinking about it? Just thoughts. So, how are we viewing things? How are we aware of things that we're not even, not even noticing? And how cognizant are we of the world that's around us, and how it's impacting how we interact with people? Just, how do we walk through the world and view the people around us that we're interacting, and how aware are we of our own actions, and where does that come from once we start realizing how we are responding? And that's really kind of getting to what we're talking about as far as this idea of implicit bias. So when we talk about implicit bias, we're talking about attitudes and stereotypes that impact our understanding, our actions, our decisions about how we do things. It's our social preferences that exist outside of our conscious awareness. We all have biases. We all have implicit biases. If you have children, you're probably going to be more biased towards making sure that they are fed than someone else's children. And there's nothing wrong with that, unless you're doing it at the expense of somebody else's children. But we all have biases. So biases aren't necessarily bad, unless they take on a power level to them, where it's our biases start impacting other people's biases. And when we talk about implicit biases, and when we talk about implicit prejudice, we're really talking about kind of a specific type of associations between categories such as old and young, black and white, good and bad, where they take on categories. People hiding their biases that they're unaware of. It's not a case of people hiding their biases. They're just operating in the world unaware of them. As I said, I did not know I was a white male. I know I was male, but I didn't know I was white until I was 35, because I was unaware of how I operated in the world around privilege and power and structures and things like that. And so once we gain those awareness, then we're able to start looking at those things. How does implicit bias work? We learn through pattern repetition. When two concepts become associated with each other in our memory, we kind of create automatic scripts in our brains that kind of facilitate a recall or a recognition of the other. So we practice this stuff, even unbeknownst to our own awareness. And in the case of racial bias, people with a negative implicit bias towards certain groups will act more quickly and easily respond to concepts associated with those negative stereotypes of those groups than concepts that are not associated. The brain has a threat detection center. The amygdala is the part of the brain that triggers a fight response that also plays a prominent role in implicit bias. So, we respond to certain situations in certain ways. I remember walking with my mom in downtown Pittsburgh, and my mom still does not remember this, even when I bring it up with her, but we were walking down the street, and there was an African-American male walking down the other side, walking down the same side of the street, and my mom made us move to the other side of the street. And purely because of a bias that I'm not sure she was totally aware of, and she does not remember it. She does not remember doing that. It was just so programmed into her to do that, it really took on an implicit nature to it. So we developed this over a lifetime. It doesn't necessarily align with our declared beliefs. So we may say we're about this, but our actions aren't congruent with what we say and what we want to believe about what we, how we do things. And so we learn it through this pattern, repetition, unbeknownst to ourselves. Ignore the word and look at the color of the word that appears. Okay. What do you see there? Anybody want to throw out what do you see? Do you see the words aligning with the color? Okay. Now ignore the word and verbally name the color of the word that appears. Okay. Was that a little bit hard for people? Okay. So there are things that we will try to ignore, but try as we might, the meaning of the word comes through, and it's disabling our ability to name something as simply as the color of an object. So we do things about social objects that enter into our ideas, and this happens in social groups as well. So, we look at people, and our thought process is often incongruent with what we're visually seeing, and that's where there's tension. How do we get here? If you look at this, we're going to start at the upper left-hand corner where it says the beginning. We're all born into the world, and we kind of are born in without biases, without stereotypes. We don't have a lot of information or a lot of misinformation yet. So we kind of start in the same place. But then we start in the process of being socialized, okay? And we're taught on a very personal level, we're taught through our relationships, through our parents, our relatives, teachers, people that we love and trust, these formative people that are in our lives, okay? People that we want them to think good of us, that we want to live up to their expectations, and they model a way of living. And I think for a lot of us as adults, when we start acting like our parents and we don't know why, because there's something that's been modeled, and ingrained in us over years of living that we're often even unaware of, that that we start acting in that same way. So the very early stages of that socialization comes from our relationships. And then we move into the world and being bombarded by messages from our institutions, our schools, our churches, our faith communities, our social groups, music, the songs, the internet, just really hits us these days, in both unconscious and unconscious levels. And I think you all can think of that. We're cultural beings, okay? Culture is a system of inherited conceptions expressed in symbolic forms, okay? Words are symbols. We have visual symbols, we have audio symbols that we all rely upon to give understanding and meaning to things. And so we're all part of a culture. Even if we don't know what that culture is or can really readily explain it to people, we have all been acculturated. And it's our set of meanings and values that inform our way of living in community. And they're shared. They come in group realities. We learn communal beliefs and values. Cultures are very formative. They shape our personal identities and how we interact within these communities. And they come in the forms of sets of meanings, values, beliefs about life that are expressed symbolically. So our actions, are often symbolic. I come from the world of theology, and we talk about symbol as a visible presence of things that we can't see. And that's kind of the role of symbol. We use language to try to explain things, and we usually come up short. We're always trying to find ways to re-explain ourselves. So when we have this years of acculturation, I was 35, as I said, when I realized I was white, and I had to unpack what that meant for me. And we have this acculturation process that gets enforced in our society. We have rewards and punishments that impact us on how we act in public. Do we open the door for somebody or not? Do we eat with our hat on? Do we eat with our right hand or our left hand? At one time, you would have been punished if you would have did handwriting with your left hand. That was a cultural norm that really didn't really make any sense, but it was just how the culture was. So these things get embedded into how we operate. And they can privilege some people, they can discriminate against other people, they can persecute, and they can empower. And how we respond to that is really when we start getting into how it impacts people on a very real personal level, how it uplifts some people, how it dehumanizes other people, impacts people negatively, disenfranchises them, eliminates their voice, causes a lot of trauma, emotional, physical, spiritual trauma in people, and it can even lead to patterns of violence and such. So this is kind of a socialization process that we're all involved in. And then the trick is, once we are aware of that, how do we respond to that? Do we try to disrupt it? Do we try to change it? Or do we just continue on into the circle and continue this pattern? And I think this, when we talk about looking at implicit bias, part of the reason that we look at implicit bias is that's a means to disrupt how we've been socialized and acculturated in a certain way. And it's done in a very personal way. This is very personal work. There's not a 3-point plan you can do to change cultural oppression and racism and things like that. It's really very personal work. And how do we look at ourselves to dismantle how we've been acculturated in negative ways? And so much of that is just gaining an awareness of even how that even exists and operationalizes within our bodies. You're hearing a lot about white privilege and whiteness, and in our culture in the United States, we have the socialization of whiteness as normative. Okay, and I would say most white people in this country would not describe themselves as white American. I don't know if I've ever said I'm white American, whereas we expect oftentimes other groups to refer to them with a certain category. Black American, Asian American. So we have this white culture as a worldview that is kind of normative in our culture. And when you think about whiteness, we don't really study whiteness. Whiteness isn't studied. It isn't evaluated, at least from white culture. And one of the people that I think really highlighted this was a woman named Peggy McIntosh. She was looking at how women were kind of disenfranchised in male culture. And as she was looking at how women were, and this was back in, I believe in the 70s, or I'm sorry, in the 80s, she was looking at how women were marginalized against in a male culture. And she started to realize that as a white woman, she also had privilege over women of color. So even though on one level she was being oppressed by male culture, she was also participating in marginalizing other people. And she wrote this article, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. And she comes up with this whole list of ways that she had implicit bias against that other people didn't have. She had these privileges that she wasn't even aware of. She had to start thinking through, like, some of her items were like that she could go shopping alone most of the time, pretty assured that she would not be followed or harassed in a store. She could go into a music shop and count on finding the music of her race represented. She could go into the supermarket and find staple foods that fit her cultural tradition. And she could go into a hairdresser shop and find someone who could cut her hair. And we just I think within the last month, had a state actually pass a law to allow black hair to be worn in work and that to be legal. And how the hair grows out of a person's head, we had to pass a law to make that legal. That's something that I've never had to think about. Of course, I'm also bald, but it's still, that's not something we think about. She's never had to speak for all the people of her racial group. She could choose blemish color or bandages in the flesh color and not have them more or less match her skin. All these things that she was unaware of and not cognizant of, kind of these privileges. And so we live in this kind of system that tends to marginalize certain people or certain categories. And where it becomes an issue is when it takes on power. Okay? I mean, it's an issue interpersonally, but when it takes on a power level, then it impacts an entire group of people and moves beyond just an interpersonal kind of interaction. So when we talk about implicit bias, bias happens in an implicit way and an explicit way. So we kind of scale up here. So kind of looking at the far right, individual implicit bias is unconscious attitudes and beliefs. When it becomes explicit, it's where someone acts upon the prejudice that they might have. Okay. Then it moves to an institutional implicitness. Policies start to develop that negatively impact the group unintentionally. So this is an unintentional thing. And when it becomes explicit, policies are put in place explicitly to discriminate against a group. So the first stage is unconscious. The next one where it's more conscious, then same thing on an institutional level. There are policies that we operate in that we're not aware of their impact, but then they can take on institutional level. So when we looking at policing as one category, but I think you could really go into any profession in any setting and do this kind of breakdown. So you might have a police officer that when they're called to a stop, if it's a person of color, they may call for backup quicker than they might if it's a white person. They might call somebody a slur when arresting them. Then moving to the institutional level, how is policing done? Where is it done? If a police department is focusing on particular types of crime, we have that in Texas where police were targeting undocumented people that weren't doing violent crime all of a sudden. They moved from only targeting violent crime people to nonviolent crime. That was an intentional action. And then to where an institution won't hire people of color. I worked in a Catholic institution in Texas that was founded by a French religious order. And despite the fact that the French priests and brothers did great social justice work, the only reason they were in Texas is because the Catholic Church in the 1800s would not elevate Mexicans and Mexican Americans into the priesthood and into leadership. So that was an institutional bias, that worked out into policy. So, so you have this movement from implicit to explicit. Okay, and you see some examples down below there. Where doctors are less likely to prescribe life-saving care to African Americans. They've documented that doctors have, they found that medical students are unaware that they have a bias that Blacks have a higher tolerance of pain. That's their belief. So because of that, they tend to prescribe less pain medication because of this implicit bias that they're often not even aware of. They've done studies of resumes where dual resumes were submitted to a company. One set had very Anglo-sounding names and one had very more ethnic-sounding names. After the name, everything else in the resume was identical. but the callbacks for the Anglo-sounding names was at a much higher percentage. My mom's watching The View, or the Voice. I'm sorry, The Voice. That's a show that's really trying to look at implicit bias. They're making sure that no one can see who the singers are, and they can only hear the talent. The whole purpose of that show is to deal with implicit bias, so that we don't judge somebody because of some visual thing or visual category or predisposition that we might have that we're not even totally aware of. So that's something that's very real in our culture that we know about. So these are just some examples of how this type of implicit bias does impact our culture. And it's really, for you, how do you look into your own community and start to identify, what are the examples where you're at and where you live? I'm going to be mindful of our time here. These are some examples from education. This is in North Carolina, where you have suspensions based on the left-hand side, you have offenses involving weapons and drugs and violence with injury. And you see the suspension rate is much higher for students that are Black. You have a much higher suspension rate for willful defiance. There's a big issue within education around the school to prison pipeline for the Black communities, and how teachers interact with students and are very quick to suspend students at a higher rate based on color and ethnicity versus the actual action that happened. So you see some more disparities here in how students are put into the system quicker. And when you have schools that have officers in that are part of the police department, implicit bias can really be impactful and impact people in a very dangerous way for the rest of their lives. So I could, there's a bunch of these, but I'm going to jump ahead just because of our time. I've been talking a lot. This is one thing in Texas I just find astounding. Texas in 2013 changed the law from, it was disruption of class and disruption of transportation to disorderly conduct, which became a Class C misdemeanor. And so once the disruption became a legal, a criminal offense in the sense of Class C misdemeanor, the left-hand side before 9/13 to after 9/13, when the law was put into place, you can just see the changes of how students were treated for similar offenses. So white students at a much lower rate were put into the system in a sense because now it's a criminal offense. It's not just a school situation. It's put into the legal system. But for Black students, you had an increase of almost 15%. So those are kind of visual statistics that just really speak to how implicit bias, based on how teachers respond to students and to conduct, if they're unaware of how they're feeling and how they're thinking about students, the impact they can have within a school system and within a community. So just to kind of get us to wrapping up, are we stuck with implicit bias? It's malleable. We got wired this way, we can rewire. Okay, we're able to do that. We can become aware of our individual perceptions, our stereotypes, and how they impact how we make decisions. We could take opportunities to learn about cultures, get to know our colleagues and associates in our backgrounds. I was just I went on a retreat, and my director for my retreat was asking me about why I was reading Christian scriptures through a lens of privilege and power. And he asked me, he just couldn't understand it. And he started talking about Black entitlements, and he said, I think Black leaders should do more in their communities. And so I asked him, well, what have the Black leaders that you know and that you're in relationship with, what have you learned from them, and what have you asked them about, what they're doing in their communities, and what are the issues that they're facing? And he didn't have a colleague or a relationship with anybody. He was speaking purely on bias that he wasn't aware of. He didn't do the work to find out. So we have to be very intentional about creating relationships and creating that awareness of other people's backgrounds or situations, because that also causes us to start looking at ourselves, and how we view ourselves, and how what do we know and what do we do not know. Diversity is real. It's here. It's dynamic. There are more than one ways to do things, and that's a good thing. It'd be a boring world without it. We have to be really courageous, have the willingness to ask questions, to really be intentional about our relationships, and move beyond our intent, but consider what our impact is. We have to know about our own biography. How have we been acculturated? Become aware of our perceptions, our stereotypes, learn about cultures. One of the things that I've started doing, and I got this from Courageous Conversations About Race, is I've started to do my racial biography, to look back into my history and try to remember events and points in my life that where I could recognize, that I was racialized in a certain way to view things, and I record that and I think on that, and how's that impacted me still today? How does that pop up? And that intentional thinking about it create, it's like a muscle. It creates, a desire and an awareness of other things that keep popping up in your life. But it's a very intentional action to go back and look at yourself and challenge how you've been, socialized to view the world. And it's an ongoing process. So for you all, for anybody who wants to address implicit bias, is, become aware of your perceptions, become aware of your stereotypes, learn about cultures, know your colleagues, recognize diversity, and engage in these conversations, just being courageous to do so. And I realize that slide is redundant with my last slide, so I apologize for that. But I think this process of implicit bias is really individual work. It's getting to know your own story and how it has impacted how you walk through the world, how you walk in your families, and do you have the courage to engage it in very real, personal, close ways? And oftentimes it means you may have to challenge those you love, those that you're in relationship with. And that's all right, because it's life-giving for you, and it's life-giving for those that you've been ignoring and been harming, and often without knowledge and desire to do that. But it does take moving beyond this intent to impact. It takes an intentionality. So I'm going to leave you with that, and wonder if you have any questions or thoughts or reactions, and things that maybe in your own experience, where you've realized that you were engaging with some level of implicit bias. We like to very fixate on the very interpersonal interactions, which is important. But I love the character Mr. Magoo. I don't know if any of y'all are old enough to remember Mr. Magoo, but he kind of walked through the world and just caused chaos all behind him. But he never knew what he was doing. He just kind of kept moving forward, but there would be chaos around him from his actions of just moving forward. And I think that's how we operate sometimes. And I think that's what I liked about that particular video. But there was an implicit bias that operated there, that your assumption was that women wouldn't be as articulate, and then you were kind of surprised that they were, and that you were able to recognize that. So somewhere along the way you were acculturated around that way, and recognizing how that implicit bias, and then how might that impact how you operate. If you're a hiring manager, are you only hiring predominantly men because you have this implicit bias that you're not even necessarily aware that you're operating under? But if you look at who you're employing, you'll notice that it's predominantly men. So there might be a bias there that you weren't unaware of. So thank you for other thoughts. Anybody else think of where they may have operated out of an implicit bias in your own experience? When we talk about bias, particularly in the United States, in a culture that is predominantly normative white, I present as white. Others present differently. If you are a Black person, you present as Black. And it's a very visual presentation. You present as white, but you also present, once you start talking, you now open yourself up to be viewed in a different way because you speak with a different language, different accent, but some of us don't have that luxury. I have this discussion a lot with my Jewish friends who they deal with anti-Semitism very in a very real, powerful way, but they also most present as white. And until somebody knows that, they could go a long way without people having a bias present itself. But if you're Black, if you're Latinx, if you're AAPI, and you visually present a different way, people can have biases against you, and very quickly. And that's where you start building into the systemic impact of how bias can really hurt, particular groups and such. So how we present is a very, big issue. And for those of you that are women, you present as women, not present as male, and you have a sense of that regardless of what your background is. You've experienced that kind of marginalization in this culture, and for those of us that are white, also we can start empathizing how other communities may feel about that. So and that's the kind of the insidiousness of implicit bias, and it's so under the surface in a lot of ways, that until we are very intentional to look at our own interaction. And you said it was in the flesh, until you deal with it in the flesh. Implicit bias is not talking about what's happening in DC or what's happening in somewhere else across the world. It's happening in the relationships you have with the person standing next to you, and the person in with your families and your very local communities, and in your PTAs, in your schools, where your children are going to school, what's impacting them as they go to class each day, that gets in the way of them being able to learn, which is the reason that they're in school. I just wonder if you had any experiences where, particularly as a PTA organization, where you've experienced some implicit bias, or have instigated some implicit bias, became aware of it in your own actions. And thank you for pointing out, in a clear way, whiteness is a construction. Race is a construction of this country, of how we have created this system. It's not natural. There's nothing natural in the human condition that gives it any kind of credence. And the task is, how do we deconstruct it? And that's the work, and that's the individual work, both within ourselves, and then how do we bring that to our larger communities that we're interacting in. I see we're at our time, so I don't want to prolong us. Take care of yourselves as you leave this time. Make sure that you're taking care of yourself, but also start to think about who you are and how you walk through the world. And how are you aware? Are you intentionally seeing how you're interacting with people, how you are operating, in various cultural settings and such, and how are you viewing people? What are the little things that you've not noticed about yourself, or how you may respond in certain settings? I have to, I realize that when I park my car in certain communities, I put my bookcase in my trunk. I really wasn't thinking about it. I was just doing that. And like, why am I doing that? What's my bias because I'm in a certain part of town that I'm doing that? And I really have no idea of what communities or what in my town, but I have a bias about it. So, identifying those things and how they pop up, and then looking at how that got cultivated and deconstructed. And that's something that's our individual work. And then we start to look at how is that embedded into the institutions that we're affiliated with. How does it show up in our schools? How does it show up in the PTA and things like that? I appreciate you participating and hearing me out, and I'm definitely open to any, if you have questions or whatever, Sonia can get you in touch with me. I think we're also going to, she's going to provide you some resources and such in the next couple of days that you can tap into, just for, for your own learning, for your own, expanding your own knowledge. So thank you for having me here tonight.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Thanks, Jim. We are going to be Jim's going to be sharing his slides soon after, probably sometime next week, and I'll post them as well as the links to the lunch break video that we showed tonight. That's going to be on the Eventbrite online event page that we're going to keep up throughout this series. So that'll continue to be a resource for you, and it's only accessible by those of you that have registered for any of the workshops. So our next event is on March 16th, which is going to be a session entitled "I Don't See Color, the Hidden Reality of White Identity and Privilege." And so again, I just want to thank everybody for their willingness to come here and start to engage in the conversations. And as Jim was sharing, I could see where some of our future sessions are going to be heading. So it was good to sort of get the introduction tonight. And I know that you all will join with me in thanking him for being here. And thank you all for attending. So good night.